Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when sleeplessness was considered both a personal failing and a medical mystery. A period when your doctor might peer over his spectacles, stroke his mustache, and say with the utmost seriousness, "You, my dear patient, require a slice of toast and a pair of wool socks." Yes, welcome to the Victorian age of sleepless splendor. Imagine it. You stand beneath the flickering glow of a gas lamp on a damp London street. It's past midnight, but the city hums with quiet restlessness. Horses clop over cobblestones, fog snakes between narrow alleys, and every now and then you catch the faint scent of coal smoke mixed with pastry dough from a bakery that never seems to close. You pull your shawl tighter, wondering why no one around you seems able, or willing, to sleep. You probably wouldn't survive this world for long. Between the coal fumes, the constant noise, and the occasional chance of typhoid, even the sturdiest night owl would crumble. Still, there's something oddly cozy about this sleepless empire, where insomnia became not just a nuisance but an entire way of life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where our sleepy little community drifts in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself inside a Victorian parlor. Heavy drapes drawn, fire crackling, and the clock ticking its disapproving rhythm. The lady of the house has not slept in 3 nights. Her husband, a merchant in the tea trade, has also been pacing until dawn. Insomnia, in this century, is not merely a condition. It's practically an epidemic. Newspapers call it the midnight malady. Pamphlets promise cures involving everything from lavender sachets to the power of positive thinking. And the medical journals, they are full of advice that sounds like a blend of common sense and gentle lunacy. Doctors, Victorian doctors especially, believed the body was a delicate machine easily unbalanced by emotion, digestion, or moral conduct. If you stayed up too late reading poetry or indulged in too much brandy, you risked what they called nervous derangement. The brain, they thought, could be overstimulated by ideas, by urban life, even by excessive imagination. The cure? Calm the nerves, cool the mind, warm the feet, and if all else fails, eat a small piece of dry toast. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, toast wasn't a punchline. It was a prescription. Bread was viewed as stable, familiar, and blessedly boring. The opposite of the chaos that kept people awake. A simple food for a restless age. And it didn't hurt that it soaked up all that laudanum people were sipping for their nervous stomachs. You sit near the fire, half listening, as the doctor explains that sleeplessness may arise from unseemly habits or from reading French novels. He suggests warm flannel, no heavy meals after 6, and a light breakfast of buttered toast and milk before bed. The lady nods gravely, as if hearing gospel truth. Historians still argue whether Victorians were genuinely more sleepless than other generations, or simply more obsessed with their own fatigue. Industrialization stretched the workday, gaslight extended the night, and the social expectation of productivity left everyone quietly exhausted. And when the upper classes grew tired, they called it an ailment. When the poor did, they called it life. Out in the streets, night workers sweep up soot, postmen deliver letters through the fog, and printers run the presses that will print tomorrow's advice on soothing the restless mind. The hum of the city never really stops. You can feel it in your chest, a pulse of progress that refuses to dim. And yet, for all their ambition, the Victorians were oddly tender about sleep. It wasn't something to conquer, but something to court. Advice manuals told you to treat bedtime like a ceremony. Dim the lamps, fold the quilt just so, breathe deeply, avoid stimulating conversation about politics or theology. One in 1885, guide warned against the excitement of excessive thought before slumber, which, of course, is exactly what everyone thought about as soon as they lay down. Even the bedrooms themselves were a blend of comfort and claustrophobia. Feather mattresses sagged under heavy counterpanes. Bed curtains were meant to keep out drafts, but trapped the smell of coal and candle smoke. You lie there, trying not to think about the noises outside. The tram bells, the clatter of hooves, the soft drip of rain down the chimney. To your left, a maid snores softly on her cot. To your right, a clock ticks its gentle accusation. Another minute lost to sleeplessness. Somewhere in the house, the toast is cooling on a silver tray, waiting to be served like medicine at dawn. Victorian insomnia wasn't just a medical condition. It was a mirror held up to the anxieties of an age obsessed with progress. Sleep, to them, was a sign of order, of control. Losing it meant losing one's grip on propriety itself. You take a slow breath, letting the sound of the fire crackle and the faint hum of the city beyond fade together. You imagine the doctor's instructions echoing softly. Warmth, moderation, and gentle nourishment. You smile to yourself. Maybe, after all this time, they weren't entirely wrong. You wake to a hazy morning, filtered through lace curtains. The kind of pale London light that looks like it has to fight its way through coal dust. The air smells faintly of toast and damp wool. Somewhere downstairs, a servant is poking at the fire, and you can already hear the streetcar bells ringing in the distance. It's the perfect hour for breakfast, and ironically, the perfect hour to discuss how Victorians diagnose just about everything that could go wrong with a human being. You wander down to the parlor, where the lady of the house sits upright, already dressed in a corset that could restrain a small bear. Her eyes are shadowed from another restless night. On the side table lies a pile of pamphlets on the restoration of nervous harmony, the domestic guide to fatigue, and your favorite sleep or the lack thereof, a treatise for the modern household. Victorians loved a good self-diagnosis. They prided themselves on being well informed about their own frailties. Every sniffle had a name, every habit a pathology. The phrase nervous exhaustion became a fashionable catch-all for everything from actual insomnia to simple boredom. You could be a successful banker, a dutiful wife, or even a bored governess, and still claim the romantic melancholy of being nervously fatigued. Doctors, meanwhile, encouraged it, sometimes because they genuinely believed in it, and sometimes because diagnosing something vague and respectable meant avoiding awkward conversations about actual illness. Nervous exhaustion, brain fever, and neurasthenia filled medical journals, accompanied by intricate diagrams of imaginary nerves like railway maps. If your head hurt, or your mind raced, or your soul felt slightly untidy, there was a label ready for you. Historians still argue whether this self-diagnosis craze was the result of genuine medical ignorance or a subtle form of social theater. In a world obsessed with reputation, declaring oneself ill was safer than admitting unhappiness, or marital dissatisfaction, or simple exhaustion from trying to appear morally upright all the time. Illness became an acceptable form of rebellion. You couldn't cry in public, but you could faint gracefully at a dinner party. You sit by the fire, sipping weak tea, and flip through a pamphlet written by a Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the more respected psychiatrists of the day. He warns that the excesses of modern civilization are producing a generation of sleepless minds. Too much noise, Too much industry, too many ideas. The body, he writes, cannot endure so much progress. You imagine him saying this while someone in the next room invents the telephone. Toast, of course, makes a cameo in all this self-diagnosis. When patients complained of restlessness, physicians often prescribed a light, farinaceous diet. That meant bread, usually toasted, occasionally buttered, and always served with the solemnity of Holy Communion. The theory went that toast was easily digested, calming to the stomach, and symbolically plain. A food so boring it could not possibly overstimulate the nerves. The lady of the house, clutching her pamphlet, swears that last night's buttered slice helped her heart slow its racing tempo. You try not to point out that the 2 glasses of sherry she drank before bed probably helped more. Still, there's something comforting about the ritual itself. The slow preparation, the warmth, the faint crackle as it cools. Maybe it's not the toast at all, but the act of care that soothes. Outside, the streets hum with motion. A newspaper boy yells headlines about Parliament. A milk cart rattles past, its metal cans clanking like dull church bells. The city doesn't rest, and perhaps that's the real reason no one else can either. You picture an endless loop of sleepless souls, diagnosing themselves by candlelight while the fog curls around their windows like a sleepy ghost. In drawing rooms, the conversation always comes back to fatigue. Do you sleep? Becomes the polite small talk of the era, right alongside. How is your digestion? And did you attend the opera? Each answer carries social meaning. To sleep well is to be simple, perhaps a little dull. To suffer from insomnia is to be intellectual, sensitive, touched by the modern condition. It's like saying, I don't rest because I think too deeply. A physician visiting the home today might ask about the smallest details. Your bedtime habits, your dreams, your posture while reading. He might prescribe not only toast and warm socks, but a strict daily routine. Morning walks, no newspapers after dusk, and never, under any circumstance, the reading of emotional fiction before bed. The brain, he warns, must be soothed, not stirred. You can't help but imagine a modern sleep doctor raising an eyebrow at all this. But maybe there's something strangely ahead of its time in the Victorians' obsession with routine, diet, and comfort. Their methods may have been quaint, but the logic, creates stillness to quiet the mind, remains timeless. You wander toward the window and watch as the fog lifts slightly over the Thames. The city feels caught between 2 worlds, half asleep, half awake, mechanical yet human. There's a rhythm to it, almost hypnotic. You realize that, in a way, Victorian insomnia wasn't just about sleeplessness. It was about awareness. They were living in a world that never turned off, a problem that feels oddly familiar. Your hostess sighs, closing her pamphlet. Perhaps tonight will be better, she murmurs. You nod, though you both know it probably won't. The doctor will return tomorrow with more pamphlets, more polite concern, and perhaps a new variation of the same advice. Maybe this time he'll suggest cinnamon on the toast. The fire pops, the light dims, the day folds itself neatly into evening, just as the Victorians preferred. And you, dear listener, are one diagnosis closer to understanding why the empire that built the steam engine couldn't quite figure out how to fall asleep. The clock on the mantel ticks like a patient teacher, reminding you that even time itself moves in tidy intervals here. You've spent enough hours reading those pamphlets of self-diagnosis. Now it's time to meet the people who wrote them. The Victorian doctors, half scientists, half showmen, wrapped in layers of etiquette and wool. You find yourself in a narrow consulting room, wallpapered in pale green, smelling faintly of antiseptic and pipe smoke. The doctor's desk is a monument to order. Rows of glass bottles labeled with long Latin words. A brass magnifying glass. A small bell for summoning the maid. Behind the desk sits Dr. Percival Finch, a real physician in the sense that he owns a stethoscope, though you suspect his greatest talent lies in maintaining eye contact while writing a bill. He greets you with a solemn nod. "Ah, yes," he says. "Another case of sleeplessness born of modern living." His voice is soft, like velvet dipped in cough syrup. You describe your restless nights, your wandering mind, the way your thoughts flutter just as you start to drift off. Dr. Finch steeples his fingers. "A classic case of nervous overactivity," he declares, "brought on, perhaps, by excessive reading or emotional excitement." You blink. You hadn't realized that thinking counted as a medical risk. But in Victorian medicine, the mind was like a delicate clockwork mechanism. Too much stimulation, whether intellectual, emotional, or romantic, could supposedly upset the system. The cure was always the same: rest, warmth, and the avoidance of anything agitating, which apparently included jazz, politics, and sometimes your own relatives. He writes a prescription: plain nourishment, gentle exercise, and the wearing of flannel socks during nocturnal hours. You ask why the socks. He peers over his spectacles and replies, "Because cold feet disturb the circulation, and disordered circulation disturbs the mind." You're tempted to point out that this sounds suspiciously like something your grandmother would say, but you let it pass. Victorian doctors were often more moralist than scientist. Many saw themselves as guardians of proper conduct. Health, they believed, reflected character. A restless mind suggested not simply illness, but weakness of will. One physician even wrote that sleeplessness was the natural outcome of indulgence in modern amusements. Imagine explaining to him that you stayed up watching Netflix. Yet these same doctors could also be surprisingly compassionate in their own restrained way. They prescribed long countryside walks, quiet reading, warm milk before bed. Their advice often carried a kind of domestic poetry, small, rhythmic habits meant to soothe both the nerves and the conscience. "Order," wrote one medical guide, "is the mother of repose." Historians still argue whether Victorian medicine actually helped anyone sleep. Some claim it did, by introducing predictable rituals that calmed people into rest. Others argue that most doctors simply reassured their patients into feeling slightly better. After all, being told you're ill in an acceptable, fashionable way was sometimes the only comfort available. Dr. Finch, ever the gentleman, gestures toward the sideboard, where a small silver tray holds the famous remedy, a single slice of toast. Lightly buttered, he notes, to avoid excess richness. He insists you eat it slowly, mindfully. The ritual feels almost absurdly ceremonial. You, a grown adult, being prescribed bread as medicine. But as you chew, you realize it's not unpleasant. The crunch, the warmth, the simple predictability. It's strangely grounding. Maybe that's the point. He goes on to recommend other methods for settling the spirits. Avoid novels with tragic endings. Refrain from discussing politics at dinner. Do not, under any circumstances, sleep with the window open, lest you inhale night air, which was believed to be a carrier of invisible maladies. Also, he warns, never place a mirror opposite your bed. Reflections at night were thought to confuse the soul. You nod solemnly, biting back a smile. It's hard to tell where medicine ends and superstition begins. Then again, modern advice can sound equally absurd. Blue light filters, essential oil diffusers, and guided sleep playlists featuring whale noises. Maybe human beings have always needed a little ritual nonsense to convince themselves that sleep is possible. Back in the street, you watch other patients file into the doctor's office. A clerk complaining of racing thoughts, a school teacher with chronic wakefulness, a widower who simply dreams too much. Each leaves with the same advice: keep warm, stay calm, eat toast. The simplicity is almost touching. Victorian medicine, for all its quirks, was rooted in one sincere belief: that sleep could be restored through harmony. The body, they thought, was a moral compass. To be well rested was to be good. To be restless was to be morally disordered. You couldn't just treat the symptom, you had to treat the soul. That evening, back in the guest room of your imaginary London boarding house, you replay the doctor's words. You put on the wool socks he prescribed, scratchy but warm, and sit by the fire with another slice of toast. Outside, the rain patters softly against the window. For a moment, you think you understand it. The ritual, the comfort, the absurd dignity of taking such small acts seriously. Toast cools. The clock ticks. You close your eyes and imagine yourself drifting, just as the Victorians hoped to, by sheer force of decorum and carbohydrates. You may not be cured, but at least you are well behaved about it. You're back in that same cozy parlor. The lamps turned low, a faint smell of ash lingering from the fire that burned down to gentle embers. On the table beside you, the doctor's most mysterious prescription gleams in its humble glory. Toast, plain, golden, and sitting beside a cup of milk that's cooling far too quickly. You can't help but wonder, why toast of all things? Why did the Victorians place such medicinal faith in something you could burn by accident and still call breakfast? You lean closer. The toast crackles faintly as it cools, releasing a scent that's halfway between comfort and faint disappointment. Around you, the sounds of a late Victorian household move like distant tides. A servant setting a tray down upstairs, the tick of the hallway clock, a carriage wheel crunching over the cobblestones outside. You take a bite, and the warmth dissolves on your tongue with a whisper of butter and the faintest hint of something. Healing? Maybe not. But for a brief moment, you understand why they believed. The Victorians loved rational explanations for irrational comforts. Toast, they argued, was a simple, digestible substance that soothed the stomach and through the mysterious web of the body's nerves, quieted the mind. A full meal before bed was unthinkable, too stimulating. An empty stomach, equally dangerous. The solution was this modest middle ground, a warm, bland offering to balance the humors. Doctors wrote about it endlessly. One medical manual from 1872 claimed that a morsel of lightly browned bread, when taken with tepid milk, will restore the equilibrium of the agitated spirit. It sounds poetic, but it was treated with deadly seriousness. The Victorians truly believed that what you ate could harmonize not just your digestion, but your thoughts. Historians still argue whether these food-based remedies were rooted in science or superstition. After all, this was the same era that treated melancholia with beef tea and hysteria with ice baths. But in the quiet domestic sphere, toast became a symbol of order. It was warm, predictable, civilized, an edible lullaby for those who feared the chaos of sleepless nights. You imagine the ritual. A servant downstairs toasts the bread over a small iron grate, careful not to scorch it. The butter, softened near the fire, spreads easily with a silver knife. The tray is carried upstairs. Porcelain cup, folded napkin, the faint scent of baked grain filling the air. The patient sits upright in bed, dressing gown wrapped tightly, perhaps reading a devotional or a book of poetry. They eat in silence, not because it's exciting, but because it's deliberately not. Excitement, remember, was the enemy. Doctors warned that even pleasant emotions could overstimulate the nerves and disturb the balance of the brain. You could be made sleepless, not by fear or grief, but by enthusiasm. Moderation, wrote one physician, is the key to rest. Toast embodied moderation. It was the opposite of indulgence, a food that made no demands and offered no surprises. And it wasn't just the bread. The ritual of making toast, the act of preparation, the familiar smell, the warmth, was its own kind of therapy. You weren't just eating. You were participating in an ancient comfort. The Victorian household may have wrapped that comfort in scientific language, but beneath it was something deeply human. The craving for calm predictability in a world changing faster than anyone could understand. Outside the window, the age of steam and progress churns relentlessly forward. Trains roar through the countryside. Telegraphs hum with invisible messages. Gas lamps flicker in factories that never close. You think of the sleepless clerks and weary mill owners, their minds racing long after dark. Maybe, after all, it wasn't the toast itself that soothed them, but the idea of something warm, constant, and ordinary in a world that had forgotten how to slow down. You take another bite and smile. Somewhere, a Victorian doctor is patting himself on the back for curing your overwrought nerves. It's almost sweet. One particularly devoted physician, Dr. John Beddoes, wrote that toast could even retrain the stomach to serenity. He meant it quite literally. The digestive process, once soothed, would influence the brain's chemistry, leading to what he called the tranquil repose of the civilized sleeper. Today we'd call that the gut-brain connection and pretend we invented it. But there it is, in all its buttered simplicity. And then there's the milk, tepid, not hot, lest it agitate the circulation. No sugar, of course, just the natural sweetness, the quiet warmth. The combination was meant to symbolize balance. One solid, one liquid, one baked, one born. It's almost ritualistic, like communion for the sleepless. You finish your slice and wonder if this was ever truly effective. Could toast and milk really lull the restless into sleep? Or was it, as many scholars suspect, an elaborate placebo dressed in etiquette? Historians still debate it, though some point out that the true benefit may have been psychological. To be cared for, to follow a calm routine, to eat something warm before bed. Those are timeless remedies. The toast was just the excuse, and maybe, in that sense, the Victorians were onto something. You feel it yourself now. The slow quieting of the mind, the soft rhythm of breath. There's comfort in repetition, in knowing that countless others once sat where you are, nibbling on toast and hoping for rest. The fire settles with a sigh, and the last light flickers across your teacup. The world outside fades into shadow, and you can almost believe that this humble ritual could steady any restless century, even your own. The fire burns lower tonight, and the air feels heavier, warmer, more intimate somehow. You stretch your legs toward the faint glow, and notice the wool socks you've been instructed to wear. They itch, but in that oddly reassuring way that tells you they're working. According to Victorian wisdom, warmth was more than comfort. It was medicine. You weren't just keeping your toes cozy. You were protecting your soul from night chills of the mind. Victorian doctors, for all their starch and seriousness, were absolutely obsessed with temperature. They believed warmth maintained nervous equilibrium and encouraged the body's vital forces to flow freely. Cold, meanwhile, was a villain, responsible for everything from melancholy to madness. A chill could seize the nerves or disturb the humors, causing sleeplessness, irritability, or worse, a loss of proper decorum. So, in the grand medical theater of the age, wool was promoted from humble textile to therapeutic marvel. The doctor's prescription, warm feet, warm heart, calm sleep, was repeated in countless guidebooks. One health columnist in the Ladies' Companion insisted that flannel stockings preserve mental harmony through the maintenance of the bodily temperature. It's as though your socks were doing the emotional labor for you. You run your fingers along the ribbed wool and think of the poor souls who couldn't afford this simple luxury. The wealthy swaddled themselves in layers of brushed flannel and lamb's wool, while factory workers slept in their day clothes beside dying embers. There's something poignant in the idea that the rich literally insulated themselves from worry. Historians still argue whether the medical fixation on warmth came from genuine physiological observation or from a deeper metaphor. In Victorian literature, warmth was often shorthand for civility and self-control. Coldness suggested moral decline or emotional excess. Staying warm wasn't just about comfort. It was about character. You weren't just heating your body. You were proving your virtue. You imagine the bedtime routine of a proper London household. The maid brings a foot warmer filled with coals, slipping it beneath the sheets to chase away the chill. The mistress of the house tests the bed's temperature with a dainty hand, pronounces it satisfactory, and layers herself like an archaeological site. Cotton shift, flannel nightdress, wool blanket, down quilt. Her husband, meanwhile, reads by candlelight in a dressing gown so heavy it could double as a winter coat. Somewhere in the same city, a doctor in a polished black coat writes a letter to the Lancet, insisting that temperature is the supreme architect of slumber. He's been studying the subject empirically, taking notes on how patients' pulse rates change with the season. The sleeper, he concludes, must imitate the hibernation of gentle creatures. You picture him proudly explaining this to a baffled patient while wearing 3 waistcoats. There's an oddly modern ring to all this. You think of weighted blankets, heated mattresses, and smart thermostats, our own age's attempt to engineer comfort with precision. The Victorians had no gadgets, but they had the same obsession: control. They wanted to regulate the uncontrollable, to make the body obey the will. And yet, in their fumbling way, they were right. A warm body really does sleep better. The difference between science and superstition sometimes lies only in language. What they called nervous harmony, we call thermoregulation. What they called vital force, we call blood flow. Same effect, different century. Still, their reasoning could wander delightfully off the rails. One particularly eccentric London physician claimed that sleeping in wool prevents intrusive dreams because static electricity interfered with the spiritual realm. Another wrote that bare feet invite phantoms. You can't tell if he meant ghosts or cold drafts. You stretch again, your toes cocooned in their thick socks. The firelight flickers along the brass fender, painting the room in slow-moving gold. You feel that strange sensation of drowsiness approaching, not the sudden drop of exhaustion, but the gradual surrender of awareness. It's the kind of sleepiness that Victorians would have described as moral serenity. The philosophy behind it was as quaint as it was comforting. That rest came not from indulgence, but from moderation, from balancing warmth and coolness, wakefulness and calm. Even their beds reflected this duality. Feather mattresses for softness, but boards beneath for discipline. Thick blankets, but windows cracked just enough to let in the honest air of providence. Some scholars think this balancing act revealed a deeper anxiety, that too much comfort was suspect, even dangerous. After all, luxury led to decadence, and decadence to ruin. So, the warm socks were more than therapy. They were a modest indulgence, a way to court comfort without guilt. You smile, imagining the rows of Victorians sitting by their firesides, feet wrapped in wool, debating whether to feel virtuous or cozy. Maybe the magic wasn't in the socks, or the toast, or the doctor's lectures. Maybe it was in the shared ritual. The quiet sense that you were part of something larger. A society determined to outsmart its own sleeplessness. The fire sighs again, and you lean back. The city hums softly outside your window, the night carried along by the sound of distant horses and the faint hiss of gaslight. You can almost hear the whisper of every sleepless soul wrapped in wool somewhere nearby, breathing in unison. For all their quirks, the Victorians were trying to tell you something simple. Warmth, moderation, patience. It's a good mantra. You tug the socks a little higher, close your eyes, and think you could almost sleep. If only you weren't so curious about what comes next. It's nearing midnight again. And this time you're not in a sick room or a doctor's parlor, but in the glowing half-light of a Victorian drawing room. A space built for both conversation and quiet melancholy. The wallpaper is green damask. The piano gleams like still water, and the smell of coal smoke lingers beneath a hint of bergamot. You're here to experience one of the great paradoxes of the age. The sleepless social life of the respectable insomnia. You settle into a velvet armchair beside a small gathering of night dwellers. The fire has burned low, but no one seems ready for bed. A gentleman reads a newspaper aloud, mispronouncing half the French names. A widow in black lace embroiders by the dim lamplight, her needle flashing like a tiny metronome. A young man recites lines of Tennyson with unnecessary intensity. You realize you've entered that peculiar Victorian ritual known as the midnight circle. These were informal salons that grew out of the sleeplessness epidemic. People who couldn't rest decided they might as well make something social out of it. It wasn't proper to admit insomnia, of course, but it was acceptable to say you were too wakeful for slumber. The cure? Gentle company, low voices, and perhaps, if the host was generous, tea. The irony, of course, was that tea was part of the problem. The Victorians adored it so much that they consumed caffeine well into the night. Doctors wagged their fingers, declaring that strong tea overtaxes the delicate machinery of the nerves. Yet every house you enter after 10 o'clock seems to have a steaming teapot at the ready, as if daring science to stop them. You take a sip of your own cup, the kind so strong you could probably varnish furniture with it. The warmth trickles through you, but your heart beats a little faster. So much for rest. In the corner, someone reads aloud from Household Words, a magazine edited by Charles Dickens himself. Tonight's article warns against intemperate conversation before repose, which makes you chuckle quietly, because that's exactly what they're doing, talking about how they shouldn't be talking. The widow nods solemnly, says she'll try going to bed earlier tomorrow, then pours herself another cup. Historians still argue whether these midnight gatherings were harmless diversions or subtle acts of rebellion. For women especially, they offered a rare sliver of freedom, hours unchaperoned by the rigid daylight etiquette. Here, among fellow insomniacs, they could talk, think, even laugh without censure. Some of the earliest women's literary societies began as sleepless reading circles, their members too restless to doze, too polite to riot. You listen as they discuss the latest scandal. A clergyman's wife who published a book on the physiology of sleep without her husband's consent. It caused quite a stir. A woman writing about the science of the body was already daring. A woman writing about what happens in bed was practically revolutionary. The book sold well, of course. Everyone pretended to disapprove while secretly reading it by candlelight. Someone begins humming softly, an old Welsh lullaby. The sound blends with the ticking of the mantel clock, creating a rhythm that feels almost hypnotic. You can imagine the doctor's advice echoing here too. Keep the mind tranquil, the body still, the temperature constant. But tranquility is hard to come by in a century that prides itself on invention. Outside the fogged windows, the city glows faintly with gaslight. You can see silhouettes of carriages gliding down wet streets, their wheels hissing through puddles. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle moans, reminding everyone that dawn will soon summon another day of work and worry. You think about the strange contradiction of it all. An empire that stretched across continents but couldn't conquer the night. These drawing room insomniacs were like moths orbiting the same flame, drawn by warmth, conversation, and the shared comfort of mutual wakefulness. Maybe they didn't really want to sleep. Maybe, like you, they just wanted to belong to the hush between hours. One gentleman, his vest slightly askew, muses aloud, "Perhaps we do not sleep because we are too civilized to surrender." The room chuckles softly, but there's truth in it. The Victorians feared losing control. Sleep was too primal, too vulnerable, too close to madness. They wanted order, even in dreaming. You picture the ideal Victorian sleeper, described in countless etiquette books, lying perfectly still, hands folded neatly, face serene, like an obedient statue of rest. No tossing, no murmuring, no sprawling diagonally across the mattress. Sleep, like everything else, required grace. You can almost hear the collective guilt of those who failed to perform it correctly. The fire pops suddenly, scattering a few sparks. The widow startles, her embroidery thread tangling like spider silk. "It's just the heat," someone murmurs. She nods, pretending not to be embarrassed. But you can see it. The tension that runs through this whole age. A constant fight between repression and the human need to simply let go. Historians still debate whether Victorian insomnia was a medical condition or a metaphor. An entire culture awake when it wanted to be asleep, and asleep when it should have been awake. The sleepless drawing room feels like a microcosm of that confusion. Polite, anxious, beautifully exhausted. Conversation slows. Someone yawns discreetly, covering their mouth with a lace handkerchief. The piano goes silent. You notice the teacups are empty now, the lamp oil low. One by one, the insomniacs drift back to their rooms, leaving only the faint scent of bergamot and the echo of half-finished stories. You linger a little longer. The chair is warm, the fire fading to embers. You wonder if the real cure for sleeplessness was never the toast, or the socks, or the milk, but this. Company, shared quiet, a reminder that wakefulness can be gentle too. As you stand, the floorboards creak, and the house exhales around you. Outside, the fog has thickened again, and you pull your coat close as you step into the soft, humming night. The next morning greets you with the weak London sun filtering through lace curtains, illuminating the dust that dances lazily in the air like it's in no hurry to settle. You stretch, still wearing your wool socks from last night, Victorian therapy by way of itchy ankles, and decide to explore another side of the era's insomnia epidemic, the booming business of patent medicines. You wander into a pharmacy on Fleet Street, the sort of place that looks more like a curiosity shop than a clinic. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with bottles of every imaginable size and shape. Green glass, cobalt, amber. Each label promises salvation in elegant cursive. Dr. Collier's soothing syrup, Ethrin drops for the restless spirit. Mrs. Winslow's sleep tonic for nervous gentlewomen. You get the feeling that half of London's sleepless population has been here before you. The apothecary himself, a man whose mustache appears to have achieved sentience, greets you with practiced gravity. A tonic, sir? Or madam? For repose, perhaps? His eyes sparkle, suggesting he already knows the answer. You tell him you haven't been sleeping. He nods sagely, as though your confession has confirmed a private theory about modern life. Quite so. The world is moving too quickly. The nerves, they can't keep pace. He sweeps his arm dramatically toward a display of glass vials. Might I recommend Dr. Featherstone's elixir of nightly restoration? 1 teaspoon before bed. Rest guaranteed. He pauses, then adds, though I should mention, the primary ingredient is, opium. You blink. Yan Sui. That explains the confidence. Victorian patent medicines were a strange blend of science, marketing, and unregulated enthusiasm. Without modern pharmaceutical laws, manufacturers could sell almost anything as a cure, provided it sounded genteel enough. Laudanum, morphine, chloroform, alcohol, all found their way into the bottles that promised calm repose or the stilling of the excited mind. A mother could buy a sleep syrup for her child that contained more narcotic than the local doctor's surgery. Historians still argue whether these medicines were more harmful or helpful. Certainly, they worked. Temporarily. But many users found themselves dependent on the nightly dose, trapped in what one Victorian critic called the fog between waking and oblivion. Doctors knew, but most looked the other way. After all, a sleeping patient was a quiet patient. You take one of the bottles from the shelf and read the label. Guaranteed free from harmful stimulants. The ingredients list is, predictably, blank. The apothecary insists it's herbal, though you're fairly certain that word just means secret. You picture thousands of Victorians nodding off each night under the gentle influence of pharmaceutical poetry. There's a darker humor in it, of course. The same society that frowned upon public drunkenness was quietly addicted to what they called soothing tonics. 1 in 5 middle-class households kept laudanum in the cupboard, right beside the sugar bowl. Newspapers even ran serialized stories about tragic heroines, lulled into sleep eternal by the sweet draught of forgetfulness. Part cautionary tale, part sales pitch. And yet, for many, these tonics were the only affordable form of relief. Doctors were expensive, therapy didn't exist, and sleeplessness was both invisible and humiliating. A discreet bottle of syrup could promise what the world would not: peace, even if only for a few hours. You turn to leave, but the apothecary stops you. If that doesn't appeal, he says, I also carry Dr. Weatherby's electric sleep crown. He produces a metallic contraption that looks suspiciously like a torture device crossed with a cooking utensil. You place it on the head and allow the mild current to restore equilibrium to the brain's fluids. You raise an eyebrow. Does it work? He shrugs. The doctor sleeps soundly, at least. You decline politely and step back into the foggy street, thinking that Victorians were equal parts genius and gullible. But then, are we really any different? We've traded laudanum for melatonin, tonics for tinctures, electric crowns for smartphone sleep apps. The packaging changed. The yearning stayed the same. Back at your lodgings, you find the lady of the house sipping a small glass of nervine cordial. Her eyes half-lidded, her smile beatific. I feel ever so calm, she says dreamily, though her voice sounds like it's traveling from another dimension. You nod, half amused, half alarmed. You remember the doctor's toast and socks, his moral lectures, his insistence on moderation, all so neat and proper compared to the chaos in these bottles, and yet you suspect even he might have had a quiet stash of syrup tucked in his desk drawer, labeled discreetly. For experimental purposes, historians still debate where to draw the line between medicine and marketing in this period. Oh, were these apothecaries charlatans? Or simply responding to what their society demanded? Instant, respectable relief. Perhaps, like everyone else, they were trying to domesticate the wildness of sleeplessness, to bottle it, to name it, to tame it. As night falls again, you lie back beneath your quilt, still half buzzing from the smell of camphor and lavender oil that clings to your clothes. You think about all those Victorian night tables, each holding a candle, a Bible, and a bottle of chemically assisted tranquility. The fire crackles softly. The world feels distant, muffled. You wonder what it must have been like to drift off, not naturally, but into that syrupy, perfumed darkness, half comfort, half surrender. And then you realize, in its own way, that's what every age has wanted. The illusion that sleep can be commanded, measured, sold, that we can somehow buy our peace by the teaspoon. You wake to a heavy stillness, the kind that fills a room like fog, soft, smothering, faintly perfumed with yesterday's coal fire. The city outside is still half asleep, its early carriages creaking like reluctant bones. It feels like a good morning to contemplate guilt, because in the Victorian world, even sleep, or the lack of it, could be a moral issue. By the 1880s, the sleepless were no longer simply tired. They were quietly suspect. The moralists of the age decided that insomnia wasn't just inconvenient. It was evidence of weakness, even sin. The body, after all, was seen as the mirror of the soul, and if your mind refused to rest, perhaps it was because your conscience was stirring underneath. You wander into a church, one of those narrow London chapels wedged between soot-streaked buildings, and find the preacher already warming to his theme. He's talking about rest, but not the comforting kind. His voice rolls through the rafters like thunder wrapped in lace. The sleepless man, he declares, is the man who cannot quiet the burden of his own thoughts. You half expect him to point straight at you. Congregations nodded to this sort of thing in polite horror, pretending not to see themselves in the sermon. Everyone had nights of wakefulness, but to admit it publicly risked implying a guilty heart. That's why most insomnia cures were whispered about privately, traded like recipes. One didn't confess to being tormented by the night. One merely said once, rest was light. You sit in a back pew, watching the faces of the faithful, some uplifted, some quietly panicking. The Victorian sense of guilt was a sprawling creature. It fed on everything. If you worked too hard, you were greedy. If you rested too much, you were slothful. If you couldn't sleep, you were morally or spiritually unaligned. You could almost feel your own nerves twinge in sympathy with theirs. Back at your lodgings, you find the lady of the house poring over her devotional book, lips moving silently over verses meant to soothe. She tells you that she's been instructed by her confessor to pray for forgiveness for her fretful nights. You try not to smile. Prayer, in her case, seems indistinguishable from anxiety management. Historians still argue whether the Victorians truly believed sleeplessness to be a moral failure, or whether it was just a convenient metaphor for a restless society. The Industrial Revolution had taught them that time was money, and wasted hours were moral decay. To lie awake was to be unproductive, to squander the divine gift of daylight labor. Doctors, eager to keep pace with moralists, wrote essays explaining how insomnia could stem from mental irregularity or habitual self-indulgence. In less clinical terms, that meant too many emotions. It was always the same diagnosis in different dress. Your mind is unruly, therefore you are. Still, you find something strangely endearing about the way they moralized everything. They weren't being cruel exactly. They were trying to make sense of a mystery. Why do we lie awake when our bodies are safe and our rooms are warm? Surely there must be a reason. In an age that believed every effect must have a cause, because the universe is complicated, wasn't an acceptable answer. You stroll down a side street, past a bookshop displaying a pamphlet titled The Sins of Sleeplessness, a guide for the moral invalid. It promises that quiet reflection, pure diet, and abstinence from novels of passion will restore the peace of the righteous sleeper. You flip it open. There's even a suggested evening prayer. Deliver me, O Lord, from the fretful tumult of my own mind. A little dramatic, but poetic nonetheless. Even the literature of the time reflects this anxious undercurrent. You think of Ebenezer Scrooge, haunted by sleepless guilt until he reforms his soul. You think of the governesses in Bronte novels, staring out of windows at midnight, too conscious, too thoughtful, too alive. Victorian insomnia wasn't merely medical. It was literary, theological, symbolic. One small joke drifts through your thoughts. Perhaps the reason they couldn't sleep was that they were too busy writing about it. Still, the guilt was real. For many women especially, sleeplessness became a coded expression of frustration. They couldn't speak their anger or their boredom, but they could confess to nervous agitation. A restless night was both a symptom and a statement. Society might pity them, but at least it noticed. As dusk falls again, you imagine the glow of thousands of windows across London, each one hiding a restless mind rehearsing the same questions. Have I done enough today? Am I virtuous enough? Why can't I rest? The city hums softly beneath its own self-consciousness. The lady of the house blows out her candle and whispers her prayer for sleep. You do the same, though you're not sure to whom. Outside, the fog swirls like unspoken worry, and the bells of St. Paul's toll midnight, heavy and forgiving. For all their moral panic, there's something tender about these people who thought their sleeplessness was a flaw to be mended, rather than simply endured. They were, in their own anxious way, trying to deserve their rest. And maybe that's all any of us ever do. The next afternoon is pale and polite, the kind of London day that feels perpetually undecided between sunlight and drizzle. You take a walk through Bloomsbury, past iron railings, carriages rattling over cobblestones, and the slow parade of ladies in layered skirts and parasols. And it hits you. The entire city seems tired, but not equally so. In the respectable houses, insomnia is discussed with faint embarrassment, as though it were an eccentric cousin who visits uninvited. In the working-class districts, it's barely mentioned at all. Everyone's too busy staying alive to worry about the luxury of sleep. Still, the newspapers speak of it constantly. The sleepless nation, one headline calls it. And even Queen Victoria herself is rumored to have kept odd hours after Prince Albert's death. But today your focus shifts to a more delicate topic, one the Victorians themselves couldn't stop writing about. The gender of fatigue. You find yourself in a genteel parlor, all pastel wallpaper and embroidered cushions, where a young woman named Eleanor lies on a fainting couch. Because of course she does. Her doctor has declared her a victim of nervous exhaustion. She's pale, quiet, and perpetually half reclined, as though she might at any moment float upward like a balloon, filled with melancholia. Across town, meanwhile, her husband Henry is also sleepless, but for entirely different reasons. His ailment is overwork, an honorable complaint, while Eleanor is told to rest. Henry is told to soldier on. She is weak because she feels too much. He is weak because he feels too little. Both are trapped in the same cultural performance of fatigue, scripted to perfection. The Victorian medical system divided exhaustion along gender lines with surgical precision. Women suffered from hysteria, men from neurasthenia. The same symptoms, fatigue, insomnia, irritability, were interpreted differently depending on who described them. A sleepless woman was a patient. A sleepless man, a thinker. You sit beside Eleanor as her maid brings her a glass of warm milk and a slice of toast, her nightly sedative. She smiles faintly and murmurs, "My doctor says, my brain is too lively for rest." You suspect her brain might simply be bored to death. She spends her days writing letters, mending lace, and walking slowly enough to seem fragile. Her sleeplessness is both diagnosis and disguise, a way to express discontent in a world that forbids discontent. Historians still argue whether female nervous disorders were entirely invented or simply misunderstood expressions of real frustration. Some see them as social prison sentences, others as subtle acts of rebellion. To declare oneself ill was to carve out a small pocket of autonomy, an excuse to stop performing, if only for an afternoon. Meanwhile, Henry sits in his club reading the Times and rubbing his temples. He too lies awake at night, staring at the ceiling, convinced that the weight of the empire rests on his shoulders. He won't admit it to Eleanor, of course. For him, sleeplessness is not a weakness, but a badge of importance. He's tired because he's necessary. The whole masculine culture of the late 19th century turns fatigue into virtue. To work yourself half to death is to prove your worth. And so they live, side by side, separated by the moral geography of exhaustion. Her rest prescribed, his denied. When Eleanor can't sleep, she's told to avoid novels and excessive embroidery. When Henry can't sleep, he's told to drink whiskey and think of duty. You can almost hear the irony laughing softly behind their curtains. A few progressive doctors tried to bridge the divide. Dr. George Beard, famous for coining neurasthenia, insisted that men and women both suffered from the same nervous drain caused by modern life. He believed civilization itself was exhausting humanity, that the telegraph, the railway, and the daily paper had overclocked the collective mind. It was, in his words, a disease of progress. He recommended mild exercise, cold baths, and, inevitably, toast. But others, like the formidable Dr. Weir Mitchell, saw things differently. His rest cure, prescribed mainly to women, demanded isolation, overfeeding, and absolute bed rest. No reading, no writing, no thinking. The goal was to turn the mind off by turning life off. Many women came out of it worse than they went in. Charlotte Perkins, Gilman's famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was her revenge on that cure. Fictional, but painfully autobiographical. You glance again at Eleanor, her delicate hands folded like paper. She's not mad, not even ill, just trapped between expectations. She can't sleep because her world is too small to contain her thoughts. Her toast goes cold on the tray. Across town, Henry pours himself another brandy, staring at the city's orange glow through the club window. He doesn't see exhaustion as confinement. He sees it as duty fulfilled. But when he finally staggers home and collapses beside his sleeping wife, the irony is complete. Both of them lying awake for different reasons in the same silence. Historians still debate who had it worse. Maybe they both did. Maybe insomnia was the one equalizer in a society divided by gender, class, and decorum. A quiet rebellion of the body that refused to perform its assigned role. Outside, the rain starts to fall again, tapping softly against the glass. You watch the droplets trace slow paths down the window, merging, dividing, merging again. In that simple rhythm, you feel the heartbeat of a restless century, men and women alike, awake in their separate rooms, yearning for the same impossible thing, permission to rest. You wake to the sound of the city itself breathing, a low rhythmic exhale of wheels, hooves, and the occasional hiss of steam. The morning is not yet bright, but already the factories hum, and the streets below your window shimmer faintly with soot and motion. You realize, as you pull your coat around your shoulders, that it isn't just people who can't sleep in Victorian London. The city itself is insomnia. The age of industry has arrived like a restless giant, and it refuses to close its eyes. You step outside, greeted by the mechanical heartbeat of the 19th century, the steady pulse of steam engines, the metallic groan of machinery, the unending rattle of commerce. Somewhere down the block, a printing press churns through the night, filling the air with the faint tang of ink and ambition. There's no silence here, only pauses between noises. Night used to belong to God, one pamphlet laments, but now it belongs to the factory. Historians still argue whether the Industrial Revolution created more sleeplessness or simply made it visible. Before the age of gaslight, the dark was a natural boundary. When the sun set, the world slowed. But now, the streets are illuminated. The trains run until dawn, and time itself feels newly elastic. For the first time in human history, night can no longer be trusted to stay night. You pass a bakery where flour dust floats like snow, glowing in the lamplight. The baker, hat tilted back, kneads dough with mechanical rhythm, another soldier in this sleepless army. Across the street, a telegraph office glows faintly, its operator tapping messages across continents in bursts of electric urgency. And down by the docks, cranes groan under the weight of empire. Tea from India, silk from China, sugar from the Caribbean, all arriving before breakfast. In this perpetual motion, insomnia becomes not a disorder, but an expectation. The factory foreman boasts of working from dawn to dawn. The clerk keeps a cot beside his desk. The seamstress sews by candlelight until her fingers cramp. Even the night watchmen admit they no longer sleep well by day. The hum of industry seeps into every wall, every dream. You stop by a public clock tower and realize how this new world has reshaped human rhythm. Where once people moved with the sun, now they move by schedule. Whistles mark the hours. Bells signal shifts. Time is money isn't just a proverb. It's policy. And if you waste time by sleeping too long, well, that's an economic sin. Doctors begin to notice it, of course. Medical journals in the 1870s describe a new kind of exhaustion, one that afflicts even the healthy. The pulse quickens, the eyes grow dull. The patient reports a sensation of constant inward motion. That's how one physician described the industrial worker. His nerves, he wrote, are as if they run on steam. And yet, even in this mechanical chaos, the Victorians tried to find serenity. Manuals appeared on the management of repose in modern conditions. They advised sleeping at regular hours, even when the world refused to quiet down. One suggested stuffing one's ears with wax or cotton wool to simulate rural stillness. You try to imagine a factory foreman doing that, and the image makes you smile. Still, the problem was real. The noise of London alone could drive anyone half mad. Newspaper reports spoke of the sleepless din of civilization, an orchestra of whistles, footsteps, church bells, shouting vendors, and the occasional cannon test from Woolwich Arsenal. Imagine trying to meditate through all that. You walk toward the Thames, where the mist rolls thick and yellow. Barges drift by like ghosts. Even here, At the city's supposed edge, the air hums faintly with power. It's beautiful and slightly terrifying. The sense that progress itself has become a living thing, tireless and self-perpetuating. Historians still debate whether industrial sleeplessness led directly to the creation of modern leisure culture. After all, if no one can truly rest, perhaps the next best thing is distraction. Theaters extended their hours. Gentlemen's clubs became 24-hour establishments. Even the invention of the late-night cafe, Parisian by birth, but quickly adopted in London, was born of the sleepless middle class. Sipping coffee while preaching the importance of rest, you find one of these cafes now, tucked into a narrow street near Covent Garden. Inside, the air smells of smoke, coffee, and conversation. Poets argue with engineers. A journalist scribbles feverishly in the corner. A waitress refills cups with the weary grace of someone who hasn't seen her bed since Tuesday. The clock on the wall reads 2 in the morning, but no one looks ready to leave. Sleep, a man at the next table mutters, is a luxury for people with nothing to do. He laughs, and the others nod in agreement. But beneath the humor, you sense pride. This generation defines itself by its wakefulness. They stay up because they can, because the gaslight and the steam engine make it possible, even heroic. And yet, you can see the fatigue in their eyes, the kind of tired that sits behind the smile and hums quietly like machinery at rest. You sip your coffee and think that maybe the Victorians weren't sleepless because of sin, or nerves, or weak constitutions. Maybe they were simply the first to live in a world that never turned off. When you finally step back into the night, the fog seems thicker, the silence deeper for its rarity. A carriage passes, lamps flickering. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle blows. Another shift beginning before the last one truly ends. The world, it seems, has taught itself to dream with its eyes open. Morning again, though in London, morning is mostly a technical term. The light outside your window looks like it has been pre-diluted with soot. You yawn, stretch, and decide to investigate a space rarely mentioned in polite conversation. The Victorian bedroom. The room where one slept after all tells you everything about how one didn't. Your first stop is a modest boarding house off Russell Square. The landlady greets you in a floral dressing gown and leads you up 2 flights of creaking stairs. The air grows heavier with each step, warmed by bodies, wool, and the faint aroma of boiled cabbage that seems to haunt every affordable dwelling in the city. Inside your assigned chamber, the bed dominates the scene, a great hulking thing of carved oak and moral significance. The Victorians didn't just sleep in their beds. They performed a whole philosophy upon them. Beds were metaphors, for class, for respectability, for the thin line between comfort and indulgence. You sit on the edge of yours. It sighs beneath your weight, releasing a faint smell of feathers and furniture polish. Above, a crucifix leans at an angle, supervising your posture. Beside you, a washstand gleams faintly with cold water in a porcelain bowl. You dip your fingers in. The shock travels up your spine. Invigorating, the Victorians would call it. You call it cruel. The bedclothes are a minor engineering marvel. 3 sheets, 2 blankets, 1 counterpane, and a quilt heavy enough to defeat a small bear. You imagine the nightly ritual of assembling and disassembling this fabric fortress. There's a reason they called them counterpanes, because the effort of getting under them countered any remaining will to stay awake. Of course, the wealthy did all this with help. In grander homes, maids fluffed pillows, smoothed sheets, and tucked in corners so sharply they could cut diamonds. Servants even warmed the mattress with heated pans of coals, sliding them beneath the covers moments before bedtime. The result? A fleeting moment of bliss, followed by mild anxiety about accidental combustion. Historians still argue whether these elaborate sleeping arrangements were meant to ensure physical comfort or moral discipline. Some say the bed itself symbolized virtue, orderly, layered, contained. Others think it was simply another way to flaunt refinement. A good Victorian didn't just rest, they reposed. But the dark side of this comfort lurked close. The same thick draperies that kept out the cold also trapped damp air and dust. Bed curtains, those sumptuous swaths of brocade, were breeding grounds for mold, mites, and bedbugs. Doctors began warning against the miasma of closed chambers, urging citizens to let in the honest air of the Almighty. That phrase sounded lovely on paper. In practice, it meant letting in soot, noise, and the occasional rat. You cross to the window and try it yourself, lifting the sash. A gust of air rushes in, smelling faintly of rain and horse dung. Refreshing, perhaps, in a theological sense. You close it again. Next, you notice the small bedside table, bearing a candle, a half-read copy of the Pilgrim's Progress, and a saucer where crumbs suggest someone's midnight toast ritual. It's charming in its way, an entire life reduced to flickering flame and fading crumbs. Victorian decor took the idea of coziness and multiplied it by fear. Too bare, and a room looked sinful, like a monk's cell. Too ornate, and it looked French, which was worse. The result was an aesthetic of gentle clutter. Embroidery, family portraits, antimacassars, lace over lace. Everything soft enough to muffle guilt. And yet, for all its comforts, the Victorian bedroom wasn't truly private. Maids entered unannounced. Spouses often shared rooms out of duty, not affection. And doctors performed their house calls right beside the pillows. Even sleep was a social performance. To be seen sleeping peacefully meant one's conscience was clear. To toss or groan risked becoming a dinner table anecdote. You imagine a sleepless woman lying beneath those heavy quilts, listening to the faint creak of her husband's snore, trying to stay still in case the movement betrayed her unease. You imagine a servant in the attic, sleeping on a straw mattress, dreaming of warmth she'll never afford. Two kinds of fatigue, one wrapped in linen, one in silence. A small mouse scurries across the floorboards, reminding you that even the grandest rooms shared tenants. You hear it vanish behind the wainscot, and can't help thinking that perhaps it sleeps better than its human hosts. Historians still debate whether the Victorians' obsession with domestic order was comfort or control. The more anxious they became about progress, the more tightly they tucked in their beds. It was as though civilization itself might unravel if a single sheet went unstarched. You lie back for a moment, the quilt pressing like a polite weight on your chest. The clock ticks. The fire in the grate murmurs low, exhausted. You think about all the people who once drifted off in rooms like this, their minds full of sermons, steam engines, and social expectations. For them, the bedroom wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a stage, a sanctuary, a confession booth, and sometimes a battlefield. You close your eyes and let the sound of that ticking fill the space between thoughts. The room feels timeless, suspended between comfort and suffocation. And for a moment, you understand why so many Victorians turned sleeplessness into philosophy. Sleep wasn't merely an act of rest. It was a moral negotiation between the world's noise and one's own conscience. And the bed, beneath all its lace and linen, was simply the quietest place to argue with yourself. By now you know the patterns of Victorian London's nights, the hiss of gas lamps, the whisper of fog through alleyways, the faint sound of hooves striking cobblestones. You've walked through bedrooms, parlors, clinics, and chapels, all trying to soothe the same restless empire. But tonight, your journey takes you beyond London, to the edges of the empire itself, where sleeplessness met something even more potent: curiosity. Victorian doctors, for all their self-importance, were great borrowers. When their toast and socks prescriptions faltered, they looked abroad for inspiration, raiding other cultures' traditions and rebranding them as new science. Colonial medicine was as much about collecting ideas as collecting specimens, and sleep, it turns out, was a particularly portable mystery. You begin your travels at the docks of Southampton, boarding a slow ship eastward. The night air tastes of salt and coal smoke. Beside you, passengers murmur of tropical climates and exotic remedies. A missionary boasts that the locals in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, sleep like the blessed, despite the heat. A young doctor scribbles notes on how humidity might influence the nervous system. Everyone seems convinced that somewhere, someone has already solved the riddle of rest. Months later, time telescopes in this story, you find yourself in Calcutta, in a garden where the night hums with insects. Here, Indian physicians practice Ayurveda, and sleep, nidra, is not a symptom to be treated, but a rhythm to be honored. Balance, not suppression, is the goal. A teacher explains gently that sleeplessness comes from too much fire in the mind, a poetic version of what modern neurology might call overstimulation. The cure? Sesame oil on the soles of the feet, warm milk with cardamom, gentle chanting before bed. You imagine the faces of the Victorian physicians reading this advice in translated pamphlets, half skeptical, half envious. It's elegant, sensory, and inconveniently spiritual. No one can patent a bedtime chant. Historians still argue whether colonial doctors truly respected these traditions or merely extracted what they could market. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. British medical journals began recommending oriental herbs for nocturnal agitation, stripping them of context but keeping the recipes. Valerian, nutmeg, ashwagandha, all made quiet appearances in apothecary shops, tucked discreetly between bottles of laudanum. From India, the colonial trade wines carry you to the Caribbean. Here, sleeplessness is treated with infusions of lemongrass and tamarind leaves, with baths scented by crushed guava. Enslaved Africans and their descendants pass down herbal knowledge that confounds European science, but proves stubbornly effective. A West Indian physician writes to the Lancet in 1879, describing a native tea that brings rest without stupor. His British colleagues file it under curious regional customs. 2 decades later, they rename it and sell it in London pharmacies as Tropical Repose Tonic. The irony is almost too easy to taste. Back in London, these borrowed cures circulate like whispers. A doctor in Mayfair prescribes Indian massage oils to his sleepless clients, assuring them that the Orient understands rest. Society women purchase imported tea blends, claiming to harmonize the humors. The same culture that prides itself on progress begins reaching backward toward the slow, cyclical wisdom of the very places it colonizes. You picture a lady of the house, sitting before her vanity in candlelight, rubbing a few drops of jasmine oil into her wrists and pretending it's science. Perhaps it is, in its own quiet way. The scent fills the room, mingling with the smoke from the hearth. The air softens. Meanwhile, across town, a young man in Whitechapel burns a stick of imported incense he bought for a penny at the docks. He doesn't care where it came from. He only knows the smell quiets his thoughts enough to make him forget, for a while, that his room backs onto a factory wall. The flow of remedies is not one way. Victorian explorers and missionaries export their own rituals abroad. Flannel pajamas, nightly prayers, and the sacred art of buttered toast. In Hong Kong, British settlers opened small hygienic bakeries to promote civilized digestion. In Kenya, colonial doctors insist on wool blankets to protect the nerves from tropical mists. The local residents, already well acquainted with the concept of humidity, raise an eyebrow and continue sleeping soundly without them. Historians still debate how much these cultural exchanges were theft and how much was dialogue. But in these moments, small, absurd, human, you glimpse something almost tender. Across continents, people who would never meet are chasing the same elusive thing. Rest that feels deserved. You return, as stories do, to London. It's raining again. A familiar sound now. Steady, hypnotic, almost musical. You find yourself in an apothecary shop that smells faintly of cardamom, lavender, and coal. The shelves are filled with imported goods. Egyptian chamomile, Indian tonics, Caribbean oils. On the counter sits a jar, labeled simply, Somnus Mixture. You unscrew the lid and inhale. The scent is both foreign and familiar, like every bedtime story you've ever heard, distilled into fragrance. You realize that, for all their bluster, Victorian doctors had stumbled into something universal. The idea that sleep isn't commanded, it's courted. It's not an act of control, but of surrender. Toast, socks, oil, prayer, all are gestures toward the same truth, that peace must be invited, not demanded. As you step back into the fog, the bells toll softly from somewhere across the river. The city smells faintly of spice tonight. Right. You smile, realizing that even empire can't conquer insomnia. It can only trade stories about it. You wake to a rare quiet, one of those thin, pale mornings when even the fog seems tired. The fire in your grate has gone out, leaving behind only the faint scent of soot and last night's warmth. The toast tray is empty, the socks a little rumpled at the foot of the bed. For once, you almost feel rested. Almost. Today, you wander not through streets or parlors, but through the corridors of the mind, or at least through the 19th century version of it. The Victorians were beginning to suspect that sleeplessness had less to do with the stomach and more to do with the psyche, though they didn't yet have the word psychology in the sense we use it now. What they had was mental hygiene, which sounds like flossing for the soul. The idea was simple enough. The brain was not a mystical organ, but a delicate muscle that could be overworked, underfed, or improperly ventilated. The mind, wrote one early reformer, requires as much tending as the body, and must be kept free of clutter. You imagine someone sweeping their thoughts into neat little piles each night, dusting them off like hearth ash. Doctors began talking about the habits of thought and how they might influence rest. Too much imagination, they warned. Too many emotions, too much, well, thinking. That word came up constantly, as if thinking itself were a form of disease. If your mind refused to stop at bedtime, perhaps you had allowed it to grow too curious. You picture a middle-class clerk lying awake, replaying the day's accounts in his head, a governess mentally rehearsing tomorrow's lesson plan, a widower listening for the clock's next tick. They all share the same quiet torment, minds unwilling to surrender. It's the beginning of what one doctor calls the tyranny of wakefulness, a phrase that feels both clinical and poetic. The Victorians didn't know about serotonin or circadian rhythms, but they were starting to sense that sleeplessness came from inside, not outside. The enemy was thought itself. Historians still argue whether this early psychological approach helped or harmed. Some patients found comfort in the notion that their minds could be disciplined, trained to rest through meditation, prayer, or controlled breathing. Others simply developed a new anxiety, fear of failing to think correctly. There were pamphlets titled How to Think Less Before Bed, which of course made everyone think about thinking less. One fascinating figure, Dr. James Crichton Brown, insisted that sleeplessness reflected a surplus of consciousness. The brain, he said, was too awake for its own good. His solution? Soothing monotony. The patient must dwell upon one simple image, he advised, until the mind is lulled. It's the ancestor of today's sleep meditations, though he probably didn't envision modern YouTube hosts murmuring about clouds. You smile at the irony. 2 centuries later, you're listening to your own voice, telling you a bedtime story about him. Somewhere, he's probably quite pleased. Other physicians promoted more creative techniques. One recommended repetitive arithmetic, which sounds like counting sheep's very dull cousin. Another suggested reciting short moral phrases until drowsiness arrived. I am calm. I am tranquil. I am a good citizen. You can practically hear the collective sigh of an empire trying to hypnotize itself into virtue. But there was a deeper shift happening here, an understanding that sleep was not just a bodily function, but a psychological mirror. To be sleepless was to be unsettled inside. The mind, wrote one reformer, is like a pond. If agitated by thought, it cannot reflect the stars. You picture that line on the cover of a modern mindfulness app. And yet, despite the poetry, the Victorians' relationship with their inner lives remained uneasy. Self-reflection was encouraged, but only within limits. Too much introspection bordered on self-indulgence. Too much imagination on madness. The perfect sleeper was not just calm, but virtuously calm. Still, moderate, respectable. Even in rest, one must behave. You visit a small clinic near Regent's Park where patients are being taught mental discipline. A woman sits in a chair, eyes closed, breathing in precise counts. Exhale anxiety, inhale harmony. The doctor instructs. She looks skeptical, but obedient. Another man stares at a candle flame until his eyelids droop. Ah, the doctor nods approvingly. Order restored. Historians still debate whether these methods were proto-psychology or just performance art for the anxious bourgeoisie. But you can't deny their charm. There's something endearing about a society that tries to reason its way into tranquility, one breath at a time. As night falls, you step outside again. The fog has returned, curling through the gaslight like a living thought. You walk slowly, matching your pace to your breathing. 4 steps in, 4 steps out. Somewhere between steps 6 and 10, you feel the oddest sense of kinship with those long-ago insomniacs. You're all practicing the same thing, the art of unthinking. The city hums faintly around you, softer now, almost musical. You pass a row of lamplit windows, each with its own quiet story. A man writing letters, a woman brushing her hair, a child asleep beside a stuffed bear. Each mind has found its own way to stillness, or at least to pretending. By the time you reach your door, your thoughts have slowed to a gentle drift. You sit on the edge of your bed, pull on those now familiar wool socks, and smile at the absurdity of it all. Centuries of effort, all to achieve what animals do without instruction. Still, there is beauty in the striving. To seek sleep is to admit vulnerability, to acknowledge that even the most rational age must bow to mystery. The Victorians didn't quite understand it, but they knew enough to call it sacred. And tonight, as your mind softens around the edges, you begin to understand too. Evening settles again, this time with a softness that feels earned. The fire in your grate crackles lazily. as though it has grown familiar with your nightly routine. The socks, the toast, the slow thinking about not thinking. You're near the end of this long, drowsy pilgrimage through the age of sleeplessness. And tonight, your story drifts toward the final transformation. How science quietly pushed the toast and warm socks aside and declared itself the new bedtime authority. You're sitting in the library of a London hospital sometime in the 1890s. The room smells of paper, ink, and disinfectant, half knowledge, half nervousness. Around you, physicians in tweed coats discuss neural inhibition and cerebral fatigue with a seriousness that borders on reverence. The language of nerves and electricity has replaced talk of souls and humors. The great Victorian sleep project is being rewritten, one lecture at a time. "Gentlemen," says one young doctor, "we are witnessing the mechanization of the human mind." He gestures to a chalkboard covered in diagrams of the brain's hemispheres. Every thought, every dream, every twitch, electrical. You imagine the toast quietly cooling in its silver rack, its glory days numbered. By the late 19th century, insomnia had lost its moral mystique and become a problem of physiology. The body, not the conscience, was to blame. Sleep was a function, not a virtue. Doctors began using words like fatigue toxin, metabolic waste, and neuronal overcharge. The warmth, the prayers, the flannel, they all gave way to something colder, data. Historians still argue whether this was progress or loss. On one hand, science liberated the sleepless from guilt. No longer was a restless night proof of sin. It was chemistry. It was the brain's stubborn refusal to power down. But with that liberation came something new: alienation. To reduce rest to biology was to strip it of comfort. You couldn't confess to your nerves or pray to your neurons. You could only diagnose them. You leaf through a medical journal of the time. One article suggests gentle electrical stimulation to induce neural fatigue. Another touts chloroform inhalation for refractory insomnia. A third, disturbingly confident, claims that sleep can be trained like a muscle if one simply practices lying still for long enough. You imagine a generation of earnest Victorians pretending to be asleep in perfect moral silence, waiting for science to take effect. And yet, despite all this precision, the old domestic rituals didn't vanish entirely. People still buttered their toast, still pulled on socks, still whispered prayers into their pillows. Progress can redraw theories, but not habits. Even as laboratories filled with whirring instruments, bedrooms remain temples of quiet superstition. One physician, writing in 1898, tried to bridge the two worlds. "The sleeper," he wrote, "is both machine and mystery." He advocated for rational rest, a balance of scientific hygiene and psychological peace. His prescription: a warm beverage, a clean conscience, and a steady heart rate. You can almost hear the Victorian ghost of toast applauding faintly in the distance. You leave the hospital and wander through the fog, past a chemist's window displaying new, modern sedatives. The labels gleam in the lamplight: bromide of potassium, chloral hydrate, sulfonal for restless minds. Each promises quick relief. Each hums with quiet menace. No more guessing, no more prayer. Just chemistry in a bottle. You can't help but feel a pang for the quaint absurdities of earlier times. The toasts, the flannels, the lavender baths. They were ridiculous, yes, but also tender. They belonged to an age that still believed comfort mattered. Historians still debate whether the Victorians were the last romantics of sleeplessness. After them, rest would become mechanical, efficiency-driven, measurable. The 20th century would invent sleep laboratories, dream charts, and the 8-hour rule. But the Victorians, bless them, still saw rest as art, a moral, sensory, human experience. As you cross Westminster Bridge, the fog glows faintly gold under the lamps. The city seems quieter now, as though even progress needs to nap. The Thames slides beneath you, dark and deliberate, like the bloodstream of history itself. You think about all the remedies and rituals that have passed through this place. Toast cooling on trays, sermons echoing through churches, tonics bubbling in glass, doctors arguing about nerves. So many ways to explain the same simple need. And maybe, you realize, they were all partly right. Toast warms the stomach, socks soothe the skin, prayer quiets the conscience, science calms the mind. No single cure ever worked because no single part of a person ever sleeps alone. You find yourself smiling as you walk, the damp air soft on your face. You picture the final scene in some unseen Victorian play. A weary doctor dozing in his chair beside a cold hearth. A patient finally asleep upstairs. A half-eaten piece of toast abandoned on a saucer. Outside, the city hums on. But inside, just for a moment, peace. It's a small miracle, and the Victorians knew it. They may have chased progress into exhaustion, but they also left behind a strange kind of wisdom, that the pursuit of sleep, like the pursuit of happiness, is both endless and holy. You turn toward home, your footsteps steady, your breath slow. Somewhere behind you, the century exhales. It's your final evening in Victorian London. The rain has returned, polite but persistent, tapping against the window like an old friend reminding you that the city never really sleeps. You're sitting once more beside the fire. The same parlor, the same half-melted candle, the same faint smell of butter and flannel. And there's a quiet sort of symmetry in it. Everything you've seen, the doctors, the tonics, the sermons, the sleepless poets, and their endless tea, comes circling back to this small domestic scene. You lift a cup of warm milk. It tastes faintly of toast crumbs and nostalgia. You can almost hear a physician's voice drifting from another century. Moderation, warmth, calm digestion. They truly believed that civilization could be repaired one bedtime at a time. And perhaps, in their own fussy way, they were right. Tonight you reflect on how many contradictions the Victorians managed to hold at once. They built factories that roared all night, and then wrote essays about serenity. They moralized rest, and then prescribed opium. They feared indulgence but adored comfort. And through it all, they chased the same fragile goal you're chasing now. A few hours of honest, peaceful sleep. You look around this room, the heavy curtains, the ticking clock, the soft flicker of gaslight, and realize that, for all their stiffness, they created beauty from their anxieties. The firelight is gentle, almost forgiving. The quilt on the chair still holds the shape of someone's recent nap. The toast on the tray has cooled, but it glows faintly golden in the light, as if proud of its absurd medical career. Historians still argue over whether those humble remedies ever truly worked. Perhaps the toast soothed digestion. Perhaps the socks really did keep the blood warm. Or perhaps it was simply the ritual, the steady, predictable rhythm of care that gave weary people permission to rest. And that, you think, is the quiet heart of the story. No one slept because they solved sleeplessness. They slept because, eventually, they stopped trying so hard. You smile at the thought of every insomniac who ever stood in this same glow, bargaining with the night. There's something universal in that gesture. A cup in the hand, a sigh, a little faith that tomorrow will come. Maybe that's what all the science and superstition were circling toward. Not certainty, but surrender. Outside, the rain slows to a whisper. The fire clicks softly, each ember settling like punctuation on the day's last sentence. You feel your shoulders loosen. The noise of the city fades, the carriages, the clocks, the murmurs, and what remains is simple breathing. Yours, theirs, mule, the whole world, exhaling together. The lady of the house passes quietly behind you, setting down a fresh pair of wool socks by the hearth. For tomorrow, she says, smiling. You thank her, though you suspect she knows you'll never quite leave. In a way, none of us ever do. We all live partly here, in this strange, comforting twilight between wakefulness and sleep, where even history sounds like a lullaby. You lean back in the chair, eyes half closed. The air's warm, the light dim. The last of the milk slides down the cup with a soft clink. You let your head rest against the cushion and listen to the faint crackle of the fire, to the slow rhythm of your own breath, to the memory of a doctor somewhere insisting that toast will cure you. And you can't help but chuckle softly. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely wrong. The story fades the way firewood turns to embers. Slowly, gently, with no sharp edges left. You're still here, but the room feels farther away, softer around its corners. The air seems to hum, low and steady, like the space between heartbeats. Let everything slow now. Imagine the world dimming one lamp at a time. The distant city streets, the parlors, the tiny boarding house rooms, the ships drifting in harbor fog, all of them breathing out together. You can still picture that simple prescription, the toast, the socks, the quiet routine. And perhaps it makes sense now. The cure was never really in the object. It was in the pause it demanded, the few unhurried minutes of warmth and care before surrendering to darkness. Take a deep breath. Let your thoughts drift like those curls of smoke that linger over the dying coals. Each one fades, softens, disappears. There's nothing left to fix, nothing left to prove. The Victorians tried, and so do you. But in the end, sleep isn't conquered. It arrives when it's invited. So, let it come. Feel the room settle around you. The rhythm of your pulse slowing to match the quiet. The rain outside has turned to mist. The world is hushed and kind. Somewhere, the clock ticks, but gently now. No longer demanding, only marking the passage toward rest. Close your eyes. The toast is gone cold. The fire almost out. You're warm, safe, and very, very still. Sleep well.